This is a rushed video. Bear with us.
What?
We hear the voice of the people. Will it be yes or no?
From CBC News, Quebec Referendum Night. In Montreal, here is Peter Mansbridge.
And good evening. Welcome to our referendum headquarters in the old Windsor Hotel in downtown Montreal. The country's future lies in the hands of one province tonight. 5 million Quebecers are choosing between yes and no, between Quebec and Canada.
There will be a referendum in Quebec. I'm happy. I'm happy with that. I'm not scared.
We intend to make of Quebec a sovereign nation. We'll have a country pretty soon.
Sir, what is it with all these men with guns around here?
Well, there's a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go on and bleed, but it's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of a social
At any
camera.
cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Well, just watch me.
On va s'organiser intelligemment, on va choisir nos terrains et nous vaincrons!
These kind of powers to local authorities, you no longer know what use or abuse they're going to make of those powers.
The province of Quebec is home to approximately 24% of the Canadian population and encroaches a stunning 1.6 million square kilometers of territory, making it the largest of the provinces. It is one of the most prominent and proud provinces of the country, with a vibrant, rich, French-oriented history and culture. But Quebec is also home to one of the greatest social revolutions in Canadian history. To understand this, one must have a basic grasp of the issue at hand. Since the nation's inception, there was always a divide between the larger English-speaking population of Canada and the predominantly French culture of Quebec. The issue really began to get serious during the conscription crisis of the First World War, when Quebecers who felt no loyalty to France or the British were forced to fight for them against their will. This slowly began to spark resentment and separatist sentiments as the decades went by. In the late 50s and early 60s, the idea of separating from Canada and becoming their own sovereign nation began to take root, as many old African, Asian, and Middle Eastern countries began to gain independence from European world powers. From this, Quebec's first sovereignist political group, Parti Québécois, began to rise into power with the intention of separating from Canada. As they slowly began to gain traction, a group rose who believed in a more violent means to achieve the goal of separatism. The FLQ was Canada's first homegrown terror group, which launched a long campaign of bombings, kidnappings, and murders spanning almost a decade. During the October crisis of 1970, Pierre Trudeau's government stepped in and enacted the War Measures Act, effectively destroying the FLQ. 10 years later in 1980, the first referendum concerning whether Quebec should negotiate with the federal government about leaving the country occurred. It failed with almost 60% of Quebecers voting in favor of no. 15 years later in 1995, Parti Québécois held a second referendum, which bluntly asked if Quebecers wanted to be an independent nation separate of Canada. But this time, only 50.58% of the population voted no, holding the country together by less than 1%. Today, the sovereignty movement isn't as strong as it once was, but many believe that Quebec will have another referendum sometime in the future.
In order to get a more in-depth feel for Quebec society, we took a trip to Gatineau.
We've sent people over before. I'm kind of scared of going over that bridge because just beyond it lies a deserted hellhole. And I'm not sure if we'll come back.
there's something strange about Quebec. The way that it is left-leaning as a province, yet standoffish and patriotic as a people. Everything from the street signs to the street lights were different in Quebec. The drinking age is lower, the smoking age is lower, and a drug-addicted homeless man even offered to sell us some mushrooms that he had picked in the mountains earlier that day. In general, everything seemed less illegal.
That guy, I don't know who he was. He tried to sell us shrooms, and I don't want to do any magical mushrooms today.
I think the block is after us.
I think they heard our conversation earlier.
In 1967, during the World Expo in Montreal, French President Charles de Gaulle delivered his famous Vive le Québec Libre speech to show his support for a free Quebec, which emboldened Quebec's wishes for sovereignty, making this move an influence from both the outside and from within. These movements have been criticized by many to be Marxist. If Quebec had decided to separate, it would be ran in an entirely different way from Canada as we know it.
That's what they think about the FLQ.
Bienvenue au Bloc québécois. Nos bureaux sont ouverts du lundi au vendredi de 9h à 16h.
In order to gain a better understanding of the Quebec sovereignist movement, we called another pro-separatist party by the name Bloc Québécois to see what the requirements were to join. Unfortunately, we weren't able to navigate their phone system as we did not speak Baguette, so we brought our translator, Tao, to help us.
Okay, so what they said was that at first they give you the business hours, and then they ask you if you already know who you want to. If you know who you want to call, then they're like, call their number. What's it called?
We're gonna find out.
Hello.
Hello.
Do you have any English services? I'm trying to join the party.
Non, j'ai pas de service en anglais.
Okay. Merci.
Whoops.
After realizing that attempting to communicate with the multiple sovereignist parties would be a fruitless effort, we decided to find someone who had lived through the volatile 1970s and 80s in Quebec themselves. As luck would have it, Mr. Brightup had a unique experience as he lived in Montreal at the height of the FLQ and sovereignist movement.
What's your role?
Dude, do you want me to
I'm the stupid question guy.
The stupid question guy. Okay, cool. No problem. I'm good at answering stupid questions. I've been dealing with Blake and Connor for all these years. So is that why you did your hair like that?
Oh no. I have to cut this.
Is it rolling, Abby?
It's rolling.
It's rolling. All right.
Hello.
We are live from an undisclosed location, holding Mr. B hostage, asking him some questions. So, Mr. B, why don't you explain yourself, who you are, where you come from?
As soon as you let me go, I will. Yeah. Who am I? I'm a teacher with the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, originally from Montreal, Quebec. I grew up during a very tumultuous time in our country's history, and I think you have some questions about that, do you?
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
I absolutely do. So, in what ways did the October crisis affect your life?
That's a huge question, and I could go on for hours about it. I did do a little bit of prep work here, and I'm going to read this because it really talks to how the October crisis changed my life forever, and it still has a big effect on it. This is a very personal part of history for me. It was the beginning of the end of our peaceful coexistence between two cultures, two founding fathers, Quebecois, and Quebec Anglais. There are two different people here, so the English and the French. It was a brutal time of deadly change that will always define a huge part of my childhood and subsequent adolescence and adulthood. As a teenager, as a child, I witnessed the army take over my neighborhood. As a teenager, I ran up against cultural fervor that culminated in the necessity of my whole family and many of my friends moving to another province because we were no longer welcomed in our home province. Imagine growing up here in Metcalfe and having some foreign culture take you over to the point where you could not exist in your mother tongue. You could not find a job, you could not be employed. My father's business was run out of the province of Ontario because he was English from Kitchener, Ontario. He could not speak French, so he could not function anymore. In my generation, And to this day, we have something called, just recently, Pastagate, where a restaurant on the main street in Montreal, Buonanotte.
Pastagate, I know.
Yeah. Buonanotte, a wonderful Italian restaurant in one of the iconic areas of Montreal, was fined by the language Nazis, we call them. And that's a really derogatory term, but you know what? There's a lot of really raw feelings here. They were terrible. They went in and they fined them over $40,000 for having the word pasta on their menu. This was just less than 2 years ago. But this is a fact, a historical one. Over 500,000 of us left within a 4-year period after 1976's election of the separatists. We called them the Communist Parti Québécois.
Wow.
We actually called them a few days ago and asked for their English services to join the party, and they gave us a blunt no.
Isn't that? So this started in '76, and much before that with the Quiet Revolution and the FLQ crisis, and we're going to be talking about that briefly, obviously. But isn't that amazing that your generation is experiencing this firsthand by just a phone call? And a huge part of me is Quebecois, but I'm English Quebecois. Right. Something that the separatists don't recognize. So it's a real interesting dichotomy, sociologically. Around and they find you. If you travel to Montreal or Quebec City or anywhere in the province, a business sign must be French, and they're really concerned with the fonts also. So if English is larger than French, the person's business could be shut down immediately. That's draconian, that is not democratic. If it's not democratic, it must lie on the other side of the political spectrum, in my viewpoint, and be something that's really dictatorial and not democratic. One could label it communist.
So, did the people of Montreal see the movement, of course being the separatist movement, as a positive or negative change in society?
That really depends on where you sat, right? If you were Français Québécois or French Québécois, or if you were English Québécois, okay? Because the English people that I grew up with, we're all over North America now. Students will hear me tell stories of summertime get-togethers with my friends from all over Canada, as far down as Florida, Texas. We were dispersed. We had to leave. So for us, it was a very negative thing. I think for the people who were mostly agrarian in society, i.e. rural, mostly uneducated, because they were farmers and they were wonderful people. I'm not taking anything away from them, but families, huge families, where education was not the focus. It was supporting the family, and this was primarily the Quebec culture. I hope that the politics will change, but as the later questions that Blake gave me yesterday will indicate, no, I don't think it'll change, and I think that there will be another referendum eventually. Yeah. I hope that's answering your question.
Yeah.
There's a lot of passion when I'm talking about this, and I tend to.
Like, there are obvious differences, like just go across the river. It's
just be a different place.
I'm telling you, it's a great place. I love it. But there's a passion, there's a joie de vivre in Quebec that just does not exist anywhere else in Canada.
A level of patriotism.
Yeah, without a doubt. And an identity, a national identity. So much so that Quebec City is not called the provincial capital. It's called La Capitale de la Nation, so the nation's capital of Quebec. So even the linguistic definitions of their societal or gubernatorial organizations are much different than ours.
One last question.
Yeah.
I know you're a Habs fan. If you had to pick
Why wouldn't you be? Hey, come on, guys.
If you had to pick one, Leafs or Sens, which one?
Interview's over. Bye, guys.
Une baguette, s'il vous plaît. It's French bread. Une baguette. It is a fine day for a cigar, is it not? Welcome to the beautiful nation of Quebec. We out here smoking baguettes. Cut. C'est un bon air.